Richard Brown is a writer, researcher and consultant on urban economics and governance. And until last year, he was at the Centre for London. He's recently been working with the Workplace London Returning project, which is led jointly by the Policy Institute at King's College London and the King's Business School. And they're bringing together London-based employers and policy stakeholders to understand how COVID has altered the way Londoners now work and what the future of employment in the city will look like. So, Richard, studies show that London's experience of working from home has been different to the rest of the UK. So, I mean, how different and why?
London, I think, all the way through the pandemic, but still now, has had higher levels of working from home. And for the workplace project, they used YouGov to poll London workers, and its first project has actually looked at London workers rather than at London residents. And obviously these are overlapping groups, but not precisely the same. And around 60% of them had worked one day in the week before the interview, much higher proportions than we've seen elsewhere in the country. And about 75% had been working at home for some of the time over the past 4 weeks. So there's a significant difference. It's about 20 to 30% higher looking at other data sources than it is in the rest of the country. And I think that comes from a number of different factors. One is London's always had more working from home. Even if you look back at the 2019 figures, there's the same sort of 20 to 30% difference between London and the rest of the country. And that's partly because London's industrial structuring, the structuring of the economy is different. There are more jobs in some of these sectors like information and communications and professional and scientific services and business services, which are more flexible, which are more easily work from homeable. And I think that's why we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of London's economy flipped very quickly to working online. And in terms of sectors like banking and some of the professional services, really output stayed pretty consistent. The people who were hit hard were the people in London, the people who work in shops, cafes, bars, etc., who rely on that daily trade to support them. So one of the differences is London's just got a very high proportion of people in those, I suppose, tradable goods, business services type activities. Another is that London tends to have more people in senior managerial occupations, and they've also been able to work more easily from home than people even in more office-based jobs who do more clerical type roles. You can work from home if you're the chief exec or the chief finance officer, perhaps more easily than if you're an accounts clerk. So those things have enabled Londoners to work more from home before and during the pandemic and still now. The thing that I think has really pushed them, the big factor that's pushed them, is the cost and time take of commuting. And in our surveys and in other surveys, that came over head and shoulders above everything else as the reason Londoners preferred to work from home for more of the week than other people. Yeah, actually, there was quite a lot of positivity about the office experience and what you could do in the office and going in and seeing colleagues. But the fact that the cost, both in terms of time and money of the commute, was a huge factor. Yeah, exacerbated by thoughts about being able to be in control, to balance work and life, all those factors as well. But yeah, commuting came out on top.
So if people are reducing their commuting, I mean, that's obviously not good news for TfL, particularly in their current situation. So do you think we're going to see inevitable decline in services unless a sort of different funding arrangements are put into place by the government?
Well, I think as far as I know, when I last looked, we're still in the midst of the latest bout of Mayor and government and TfL funding negotiations, and hopefully that's getting nearer to some sort of steady state. You know, what we're looking at in terms of tube use at the moment is it's down still about, it's around 70 to 80% of pre-pandemic levels. But the patterns are changing, interestingly. Weekends are much closer to pre-pandemic levels. People are quite happy to come into London now for leisure purposes. In fact, they're almost rediscovering the city in some ways. And midweek, they're also pretty high, Wednesdays and Thursdays. It's the ends of the week and perhaps typical commuting times that are still below pre-pandemic levels. I think there's a couple of things to say there. One is we don't know. At the moment, we know that Londoners are wanting to come into work less often. We don't yet know how far employers may get tougher about that, how far employers who tend to want people to work in the office more may start cracking the whip. And if we hit this quite grim looking recession that's in front of us, how far people will feel the need to be in the office, and that actually employers are in a more powerful position. So we may not yet be in a steady state. There may still be a slight increase in coming into the office. Also, if employers do reduce London footprint, reduce their real estate footprint in London, will that create space for new occupants to move in? One of Alex Jan, who's also been working on this project, describes this as the Heathrow landing slot model. If BA gives up one of its landing slots at Heathrow, somebody else moves into it pretty quickly. So we know that there's a lot of demand for high-end offices. Will some of that medium to low-end office space become available for firms that might not have been able to find a central London foothold previously? So those sort of things could mitigate the extent to which this is a long-term reduction in passenger numbers. And also, of course, tourism is still slightly suppressed, so we don't yet know when tourism will get back to steady state. Again, tourism is about a third down nationwide where it was before the pandemic. So again, there's some more space to make up there. But yeah, I think there is a question, having said all that, of whether TfL can really sustain the funding model it had before the pandemic, where it was reliant almost entirely largely on fares, with limited government subsidy. And actually the Tube there was one of its surplus making bits that cross-subsidised buses, cross-subsidised other services. I think that aside from fall off in commuting, there are new modes of transport, electric vehicles, micromobility scooters, etc., that again eat into their cost base. We argued at the Centre for London, and this isn't part of the workplace project at all, but we argued at the Centre for London that in the medium term, we really needed a dynamic London-wide system of road user charging that actually enabled not just the simple boundary charge that you have around central London at the moment with the additional boundary for the ULEZ, but something that actually took account of the time of day, the type of vehicle that you were using, how easy it was to find alternative routes. I think that's got to be part of the future in London. And actually, I think if London doesn't start bringing something in like that, and the mayor has said he's going to look at it, the risk is the government will do it and they'll take the revenue. So yes, I do think that there's a long-term change needed there.
But an election is not that far off. So will Sadiq Khan do it anytime soon, do you think?
Well, I think that's tough. There's been the unfortunate matter of the pandemic. I mean, it would have been great if the election had taken place in 2020 and he'd been able to commit to that and actually, a bit like Ken Livingstone with the congestion charge, give it a chance to bed down before the next mayoral election. That hasn't happened. Maybe it's something for the next term. I can see that less than 2 years from the next election, he may be a bit more nervous. But I think there's still clearly some way to go in negotiations with government, though I suspect they will push the mayor towards generating more revenue within London, given the state of public finances overall. And I suspect that's what they're doing at the moment. And B, I think there's still some distance to go in seeing what steady state is in terms of commuting patterns and tube use patterns and how close they get to where they were.
You showed that the majority of workers seem to want to work from home, anything like 1 up to 3 days a week, and they say the old ways are never coming back. So what do you think that is going to do to the CAS? Because maybe there are more visitors coming in, but having people there fewer days a week working is going to reduce hospitality income and probably put a lot of people out of business in that area, isn't it?
I think it's going to be pretty turbulent. However, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there's a gulf between 75% of workers in London saying we're never going back to the old ways, and employers who are still perceived by workers, and when they're separately interviewed, saying, yes, some of them see some working from home as part of the long-term arrangements, but I don't think they're in quite the same place yet. So there's yet to be that convergence of what people's views are. There may also, as I said, be substitutes, be new arrivals coming in as some businesses take up less space. And without getting into the detail of it, the critical determining factor there is if everyone's coming in midweek, you probably need the same office space because you're going to have everyone in the office for 2 days a week. It's if you can stagger teams, if you can use that space more efficiently, then you make more space perhaps for new entrants to come in. And tourism is also a major contributor. One of the things the GLA looked at during the pandemic was the impact of on central London. And I think the impact of the loss of tourism was 10 times bigger than the loss of commuters. That said, this is not a blanket change. I mean, we all know the pubs, the bars, the restaurants, the cafes that service a largely commuter market are in different places. They're different types of venue, different types of facility from those that might be meeting the tourist market. So I suspect the net effect may be limited by the facts I've just mentioned, but it will probably hit some locations and some outlets very hard, particularly when it's put alongside the long-term problems of food price inflation, labour shortages, all the things that London hospitality industry has been struggling with for some time. I think the challenge with all of this also is, and I suppose we're speaking on the day when we've just had very gloomy news from the Bank of England at lunchtime, is to distinguish what are some of the structural changes that are going on to London's economy as a result of new ways of working post-pandemic, and what are some of the cyclical effects that are resulting from the particular storm of economic circumstances, from inflation to likely recession, that are hitting us at the moment. And we need to put long-term responses into one and short-term responses to the other, maybe.
And some of the responses you're seeing in the city in West End, the city has launched Destination City as a programme. How do you think they should be responding to the reduction of people coming in during the week?
It's worth mentioning there's a piece of work being done that I'm also advising Arup on for Central London Forward, looking at just some of those policy issues. So I don't want to steal too much thunder from that, but I think that initiatives like that to bring people, to remind people of the broader offer of Central London is very important. I think if people have choice of where they're going to work, then you need to make it worthwhile for people to come in and spend time and money in Central London. And you could easily see, and I think I've been doing this to a certain extent, I'm sure a lot of people have, if you only go into Central London 2 or 3 days a week, you probably concentrate some of your social activity in those days. You make sure that you have the coffees, you have the lunches, you have the drink after work that might otherwise be a bit more dispersed. But I think making the city somewhere that is a good place for the city more broadly, not just the City of London, making Central London a place that is fun to visit, it's an enjoyable place to come and work, it's got the public realm, the quality of life, the green spaces, the type of environment that makes for sociability, makes for conviviality, makes for, oils the wheels of agglomeration and agglomeration benefits, I think is really important. That all sounds quite wishy-washy, I suppose, but the city's been doing this for some time. The city's been, pushing more retail and hospitality-led offer alongside financial services. That has already changed the city very dramatically from, when I was first started visiting it, and it was dead after 5 p.m, to be honest. I think there are other things that need to be done, maybe. I think there will be vacant premises, not just high street premises, but perhaps lower grade office space. And I think local authorities do have a role in trying to make sure that is used. And similarly to the, the broken windows theory of crime, it only takes a few shut down shop fronts to make a street feel very desolate, very forlorn, make it somewhere that people don't want to be. So making sure that they can put in place interim uses, put in place temporary uses, work creatively with landlords to bring buildings back into use, I think that'll be really important. And I think that'll be particularly through the recession that we're probably facing up to. I think the challenge will be to find the right path between, retaining some flexibility so that business growth can take place again, while also allowing a degree of change. And Centre for London, my former colleagues, it was something I left before it was finished, but they've recently done a report on, how you can bring more residential use in Central London, which actually probably adds to Central London's resilience without undermining its, its unique offer for commercial, office-based, and international retail services. And I think getting that balance right is tough, particularly because some of the office space that becomes vacant will be perhaps lower grade office space, won't perhaps be that appealing either as residential space. So some really intelligent retrofit and reuse, because I think demolishing large areas of office buildings and trying to replace them with flats probably feels very unproductive in terms of carbon cost, as well as unnecessarily damaging to London's urban fabric.
Well, I must say, I don't think your placemaking ideas are wishy-washy at all. I think that's absolutely central to getting people back in, creating better places. But Richard, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much for asking me.